Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for the time today. How you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Excellent. So this is being advertised as your last tour, but I got to tell you, from reading at least the start of this latest book and listening to your podcast regularly, it doesn't seem like you're really missing a beat. So why is this your last tour, at least as it stands right now?
I'm getting on a bit, and I get a bit bored with traveling. It's not the last time I shall be lecturing in the United States, just the last time I'll be doing a major tour.
That's fair. And you are doing so in support of your newest book, The Genetic Book of the
Yes,
Dead, a
yes.
Darwinian reverie. And what was your goal with this book, considering you've done such a great job of covering the subject of genetics and evolution in the past?
I suppose all my books are, in a way, looking askance at what is already familiar to people. So it doesn't present new data or anything like that. It's just another way of looking at what I've already looked at before. And I've done that. I've done other ways of looking at it, turning things upside down, looking at it in a different way. Sometimes people see things which they haven't seen before if I put it in a different language. So that's what it's sort of the goal of it.
Was there something that surprised you in looking at things differently as you were going through the research and writing this book?
I'm not sure about that. I've written chapters before with the same title, or a chapter before. I think it was in Unweaving the Rainbow with the same title. Um, no, I suppose in a way I mean the book has a sting in the tail as the selfish gene does. In this case, it's the idea that every one of our own genes could be regarded as a kind of member of a colony of equivalent to viruses working together um, to propagate themselves. So that I've even said our own genes are a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses.
Yeah, it makes sense when you think about us as humans that we're that on a larger scale in a lot of ways too, right?
I suppose you could say there is an analogy there, yes.
So I'm not even close to the end of this book, but I was fascinated to learn, as somebody who has spent most of my life in radio, that you have a little bit of radio in the background via your Cornish grandfather, who actually worked for the Marconi Company in the early days of radio. I believe he was actually teaching engineers how things worked. What did he teach you about how radio works, and how did that really make an impact on you and your curiosity about things going forward, Richard?
I wish I'd learned more from him. He retired, and when he retired, he kind of took retirement seriously and refused to talk about radio, which is very unfortunate. I did once ask him about Fourier analysis, and he said, "Oh, I know nothing about that, nothing about that." And then, for the rest of the day, he would kind of cruise up to me from time to time and tell me a little bit more about Fourier analysis, and then he'd potter off again, and then he'd come back and tell me a bit more about Fourier analysis. So that was about the extent of it, actually. He was never eager to actually impart his knowledge. I did hear, though, that he was a very good teacher and that he did a very good job of teaching the students. He was a standard textbook of shortwave radio communication. It was called shortwave wireless communication, I think. How the radio signals bounce off the heaviside layer. And that textbook was, I think, much used in its time in the 1930s and 40s. Obviously, hopelessly out of date now.
So, do you think that your grandfather is where you get your teaching ability from? Because you've obviously received a lot of praise over time for your ability to take complicated information and put it in terms that the layperson is really able to understand.
I don't know. It's very kind of you to say that. I have an uncle on the other side, on my father's side, who was extravagantly praised for his teaching ability. He also taught at Oxford. He taught statistics to biologists, and it's notoriously difficult to teach statistics to biologists. And he was very, very good at it. So if I have any of that sort of hereditary teaching ability, maybe I get it on both sides of my family.
Why do biologists have a hard time with statistics, do you think?
I don't know. I think people who are good at mathematics and want to do science perhaps tend to go into the physical sciences. It would be a shame because but I think that may be true. Although there is a lot of mathematics in modern biology,
Interesting. How
certainly.
is it doing that?
Oh, well, ever since the 1930s, in my own field of evolution, there's a lot of mathematics in the changes in gene frequencies, which is what evolution actually consists of.
Hmm.
That's very mathematical, and mathematical geneticists of the 1930s, early 1930s, were very influential.
You famously wrote a letter to your 10-year-old daughter that talked about the need to challenge beliefs and where beliefs come from and whether they're backed by evidence or backed by, let's just call it conjecture to put it simply. Obviously, there are a lot of pitfalls with parenting. There have been throughout time, but we're in such a unique point in time as well. What do you think the biggest challenge is for parents in 2024?
Well, I wrote that letter when she was 10, and I was trying not to indoctrinate her with my own beliefs. I was trying to say, be open-minded, but be critical, and to ask, if ever you're told anything, to ask, what's the evidence for that? Because really, evidence is the only reason to believe anything about the real world. And too many people believe things on authority or because says so in some authoritative book, even revelation. There are all sorts of bad reasons for believing something. And I wanted to get across to her that you should ask for evidence. When you're only 10, of course, it's rather more difficult. But for university students, which are the ones I've been teaching all my life, I try to make them think, make them ask questions, make them prepared to talk about counterfactuals, talk about things that might not be true, but let's just suppose they could be true. Then what will the consequences of that be? And that's the kind of thing which I think university students need to exercise their minds doing.
I think people in general need to do a better job of that. We've all become so set in our ways that not only do you need to be willing to engage in civil discourse at times, but you need to be willing to challenge your own viewpoints because things are constantly changing. Very little remains stationary, but sadly, we get very complacent in our own comfort zones. And as a result, we become much more tribalistic and much less willing to work with one another for the betterment of humanity.
That is so true. And I think it's also true that the pace is accelerating so much. What I find astonishing is that the human brain actually is coping reasonably well and was never built to cope with the kind of massive amounts of information that we now have and the rates of change of information and so on. Our brains were built to cope with surviving in Africa in the Pleistocene in rather close to nature ways. And it's really astonishing that we are capable of doing as much as we do.
How well did your 10-year-old daughter understand that letter? Because it was a beautifully written letter, but it was also very mature and it was filled with information that not all 10-year-olds might understand.
Funnily enough, I was rather too shy to ask her. I don't know. Um, I mean, she said she liked it, but it's hard to tell exactly. I've had a lot of people saying nice things about that letter. People say don't often say nice things about everything I write, but that particular thing seems to be got a lot of praise.
There's always somebody out there to hate a little bit of everything, isn't there?
Yes, yes.
So this conversation is appearing a couple of different places. One is my podcast, Books on Pod, but it's going to air first on my ESPN Austin radio show. Considering the subjects that you typically cover, have you appeared on a sports radio program before, Richard?
I don't recall having done so. I'm not entirely sure what a sports radio program is, but it's a pleasure anyway.
Are there any sports that you enjoy watching in your downtime?
I enjoy cricket actually, which I suppose is not rather outside your field. It's a very slow game, but it's a strategic game. And at the top level, it takes 5 days, which really rather boggles the mind of most Americans.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if there is a sport that takes 5 days, it's usually a series. So there's a game and there's a game a
Yeah,
couple of
yeah,
days
yeah.
later and a
Yes,
game a couple
yes.
of days after that. For a game to take 5 days, obviously they're having to take breaks at a certain point so everybody can
Oh,
eat.
yeah. They have, but the strategy includes looking at the weather and wondering whether on the fourth day it's going to rain, and will that change the tactics and so on.
Fascinating. There is a an ongoing conversation having to do with trans females competing against biological females in sports. Coming from your area of expertise, what do you think about that subject? But because it seems to me like something where there is a whole lot of posturing and a whole lot of arguing in the face of common sense.
I agree. I feel rather strongly about it. As a biologist, I think it's very clear to define. I mean, for example, particularly in the uh, recent Olympic Games, two boxers who I think it's pretty clear are biologically male. In this case, they're not actually trans in the sense that they don't they're not pretending. I mean, they appear to be have female genitals, and they appear to have been brought up as female, and they probably genuinely, sincerely think they're female. But it also seems to me very clear that they have Y chromosomes, and they have the physical strength of a post-pubertal male, which in boxing is serious because they are have the reach, they have the power, which no woman normally has. And so I think that they should be not have been they should not have been allowed to compete as women in the Olympics. And I think that they should have their gold medals taken away from them. But I am sympathetic because they're not trans. I mean, they actually genuinely have they have female genitalia. I'm pretty sure, and they think they're female. But it's also, I think, very clear they are genetically male. Um, if they wanted to, they could easily, if they think they're genetically female, it's a very simple thing to have a test to see whether you've got a Y chromosome. I'm virtually sure they've both got Y chromosomes. They are genetically male.
And it's as simple as an oral swab, correct? So
Yeah,
it's easy and it's cost
exactly.
effective
Yeah.
too.
Oh yes, it's extremely simple, and you could, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a blood test. It can be just an oral swab, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious to ask you about this because become common to say around college football circles, which is one of the most popular sports in this country. And this originated with a guy who is looked at as the greatest college football coach of all time, Nick Saban, who recently retired from the Alabama Crimson Tide. He liked to tell his guys in the media that either you adapt or die. You either adapt or you go the way of dinosaurs, which I've always taken a slight issue with. So, what do you think about the idea of adapting or dying like the dinosaurs? Because it seems like it wasn't as simple for the dinosaurs as merely just adapting to their surroundings.
No, that's a bit out of date because he probably said that at the time when it was thought that the dinosaurs, proverbially the dinosaurs didn't adapt. I mean, they were sort of were overtaken by events. It wasn't like that. I mean, we now know that the dinosaurs went extinct because of a catastrophe, which anybody couldn't have possibly foreseen or done anything about. The world was bombarded by a gigantic projectile from space, a huge comet or meteorite, which killed most of life or very large sections of life. And there's nothing the dinosaurs could have done about it. So it's a bit unfair. But yes, I mean, that's now a very interesting field of research. I mean, the evidence is now very clear that that's what did for the dinosaurs. And it's going to happen again. I mean, there will be another major collision. There are minor collisions all the time. There will be another major collision. Nobody knows when. And we are the first species that has any possibility of anticipating that, of seeing it coming, and even doing something about it. And it is possible to do something about it, almost possible with today's technology, possibly not quite. But um, what you have to do is you have to uh, compute the orbit of the projectile, which will be an elliptical orbit around the sun, similar to ours. Ours is nearly circular. And you work out that it is in danger, the two orbits are in danger of coinciding with each other. All you have to do is either speed up the asteroid or slow it down. to nudge it into a different orbit. And it doesn't have to be very much. It's only a matter of a few miles per hour, maybe 4 or 5 miles per hour difference. That's just enough to nudge it into a different orbit. And that's, put it like that, it's not as though it's speeding straight towards us like a speeding bullet. It's actually just in an orbit which is likely to coincide with ours. So you just speed it up or slow it down. And if the dinosaurs had the technology, they'd still be here, but of course they didn't.
Now that's obviously not simple, but it seems a lot simpler than how what Bruce Willis made it out to be in the movie Armageddon back in the 1990s.
I don't think I saw that movie, but how did they do it in that case?
They got a bunch of guys who worked on an oil rig and then sent them into space to get atop the asteroid. And I think they had to implant a nuke into the asteroid to blow the.
Yes, no, that's the kind of thing you might have to do.
Oh wow,
Um,
okay.
bec
So
because
The Bruce
because
Willis
I mean,
possibility is still on the table.
yeah, when I said a few miles per hour, 4 or 5 miles per hour, remember this is a gigantic object, and
Hmm.
so the inertia is huge, and so you would need to be it be when the word nudge it sounds like a small amount, and it is a small amount in terms of miles per hour, but it would need a lot of energy to push it either slightly faster or slightly slower, so that a nuke would probably be or might well be necessary.
Successful people tend to make mistakes. Not just that, they tend to make a lot of mistakes because you have to make mistakes to truly learn. Considering some of the great successes that you've achieved throughout your life and your career, what is a major mistake from that time, and what was the lesson that you learned from that, Richard?
A scientific mistake in terms of scientific error. I mean, I'm not sure it's worth expounding. I was certainly wrong about in the first edition of the Selfish Gene. I was certainly wrong about the so-called handicap principle. Probably not time to say what that is, but it was an idea put forward by an Israeli zoologist called Amos Zahavi, and I, along with everybody else, rather ridiculed his idea. And then later, by the time I came to write the second edition of The Selfish Gene, mathematical modeling had shown that actually Zahavi's idea could work. And so I had to climb down about that, which I did. And sound like climbing down. I mean, they don't mind being accused of flip-flopping like politicians do. Um, they it's a thing. I mean, because when a scientist is wrong, that gives them something to do, something uh to improve upon.
You coined the term meme, which over the last several years has come to mean something a little bit different. What do you think about that term that originated with you coming to mean some sort of weird picture with some cutesy text surrounding it?
It's a bit of a shame, I think, because I meant something rather precise by it, a cultural equivalent of a gene, which might be the basis of a form of Darwinian selection. The cutesy picture you're talking about is, I mean, it is a meme in the strict sense, but it's just a very small subset of what is a meme. It's a meme to the extent that it spreads like an epidemic, like a virus. I coined the phrase virus of the mind, things going viral. Um, and it's just one example of something that goes viral.
You've covered animals a lot in your writings and in your lectures. Do you have a favorite animal?
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think so. I mean, if you mean one that I find amusing to look at, I sometimes think there's a lemur in Madagascar called Vera's shafaka, which dances along on its hind legs in a rather human-like way. So that's quite a funny animal. It's not a serious question, though. I mean, a favorite animal. I'm fascinated by all animals because they're all different manifestations of the same fundamental urge of genes to propagate themselves.
What about a favorite animal to study?
No, I don't. I mean, there are particular animals which are much studied because they're very convenient, like Drosophila fruit flies, for example. So, I mean, they are very useful for that reason. Another one more recently is little tiny roundworm called Coenorhabditis, which is a a very handy, a very convenient animal, which thousands of people study and in a very useful way. But and I, I don't think I have a particular favorite in that sense.
Fair enough. We're at a weird point in time where very basic rules of language seem to be broken, or there's an attempt to redefine these things. Does that worry you for the future of humanity that we're making seemingly simple concepts so complicated now?
What examples do you think? I think I agree with you, but what sort of examples are you thinking of there?
I mean, maybe the most base example from going back and earlier in our conversation is biological males wanting to be called females, but
Yes,
not just that,
yes.
wanting to be referred to in plural terms. Like that has confused me on more than one occasion. And it's like, why do we have to complicate things this much? I want to show respect for my fellow human, but it gets to a point where this idea of inclusion and inclusivity actually has the opposite intended effect, where it becomes exclusive and you're completely screwing over a large swath of society as a result of trying to cater to or kowtow to a select few.
I totally agree with you. Um, I mean, on the one hand, words do change their meaning, and if you look back at the meanings of words in historical time, they do change. And words are our servants, not our masters. We are at liberty to say, for my purposes, I wish to define such and such a word in a different way, and that's okay as long as you define it clearly, and then other people will know what you're talking about. But to in a dictatorial, bossy way, redefine a word and then expect everybody else to fall in line and accept your definition because you say so. So to define a woman as anybody who thinks she's a woman or thinks he's a woman, um, they're welcome to think they're a woman if they want to, but they're not welcome to impose that belief on other people and force them, expect them on somewhat bossy grounds to kowtow to that and follow their reasoning, especially when it has the consequence of, for example, males, biological males going into female changing rooms and stripping off to swim or whatever it might be. That is taking a redefinition of a word, which is a private redefinition, which you may be entitled to do, but this is imposing your private definition. Things because I define myself as a woman, even though I have a penis. I define myself as a woman. Therefore, I'm allowed to go into a female changing room and change and enter a female athletic event. You have to accept my definition. That's going much too far, and that is a subversion of language, which I deplore.
Well, I feel part of the nuance of supporting somebody, and by the way, a great example of that is parents and their kids. You support your kids by not always giving them what they want, but by sometimes teaching them when they're crossing certain lines and infringing on the rights of others. So that same thing can apply here too. It is possible to support somebody by telling them no at times.
I agree. Yes.
What is your idea of happiness? And do you think seeking happiness is important in life?
Of course, seeking happiness is important. Not in an over selfish way. I mean, seeking happiness for others as well as for oneself, insofar as that can be done. Yes, of course, seeking happiness is important. Seeking happiness for others as and for oneself.
What do you think the key to happiness is then?
I have no special expertise in that. I mean, it's I don't have any great. I'm not a great sort of guru who can answer that kind of question. It's the kind of question Socrates might be asked, and I'm no Socrates.
Well, I think
Each person has their own answer to that question.
you're more philosophical than you give yourself credit for, Richard. What makes you happy then? How about that?
Well, I suppose minimal I mean freedom from pain, freedom from discomfort, obviously. But otherwise, I mean music. I don't go for sport very much, but I can imagine other people do. human companionship, human love, um, affection, obviously things I'm not the right person to ask about that. I don't articulate that kind of an answer to that kind of question very well.
Fair enough. All right, last question now, Richard. What do you love about science?
It's true. It's profound. It is it's wonderful because it teaches us where we come from, why we exist, why the universe exists. We're not here for very long, and to spend our short time here discovering why we're here and what it is what is this place in which we find ourselves, this universe in which we find ourselves. What a privilege it is to be able to do that, and especially to live in this time in the 21st century when we have the build-up of so many centuries of wisdom and science in the past. There's much more to be discovered, and I wish I was going to live long enough to see it. But it is a privilege to live in the 21st century when so much already is known and so much is being known, being discovered all the time.
He is the great Richard Dawkins, going to be here in Austin on Saturday, September 7th at ACL Live at the Moody Theatre. It is an evening with Richard Dawkins and friends, the final bow, his last tour on the road. And I believe he's going to be joined by an exceptional interviewer and conversationalist, Chris Williamson, here in Austin. Going to be with Coleman Hughes in Dallas tonight as we speak on September 4th. By the way, that new book that is the tour is supporting is The Genetic Book of the Dead, Darwinian Reverie. And you can find out more info at richarddawkinstour.com. Richard, this has been an honor and a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you for humoring some of my silly questions and the more serious questions, too.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
You're still watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or elsewhere. I would greatly appreciate you subscribing to the show and like today's episode. Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. Thanks to you for hanging out. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. Talk to you next time, Books on Pod.